It's a pleasure to be back here on Capitol Hill. First of all, I want to thank Rosita Panini, the president of our organization, who's here. Thank you so very much, Rosita, for all that you do. The topic of the talk is Israel in the new Middle East, north, south, east, west, and space. So an awful lot to cover. To my left is Mr. Mike Morell, former acting director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And to my right is Mr. Yaakov Peri, former head of the Shin and former Minister of Space and Technology for the State of Israel. One final thing before I get to my first question. A special shout out, and I hope he'll see it, to a young man named Brandon Leach. Brandon is somebody who brought the connection between the two of us. I'm sorry he wasn't able to make it today, but we look forward to seeing him in due course. Thank you, Brandon, for everything. My first question, I'm going to pose it to you, Mike. There's a lot of talk about the new Middle East. We hear about this all the time. Define for us, beyond the obvious, what precisely people mean when they say the new Middle East, from Israel's perspective, if you would.
So first of all, thank you all for coming. It's an honor for me to be up here. It's an honor for me to participate in this discussion. I think discussions like this are extraordinarily important. Let me do two things in answering the question. One is, let me tell you about the old Middle East. And the reason to tell you about the old Middle East before getting to the new Middle East is it's still there. And the old Middle East, in my view, is characterized by three dynamics that are long-standing, that are wickedly hard to solve, and are intermingled, and they reinforce each other. The first is the failure of governance in every country in the Middle East except two, Israel and the United Arab Emirates. The failure of governance is essentially the populations questioning whether their lives are going to get any better, and questioning, most importantly, whether their children's lives are going to get any better. And that's what people showed up in Tahrir Square to protest. And those feelings are still there across the region. The second is Iran's pursuit of hegemony in the region and the region's pushback against that. That's long-standing. That's not just this Iranian government. That is not just the clerical government. This goes way back in Iranian history. This is much less of a Sunni Shia thing than it is a Persian Arab thing. It's long-standing. It's not going away. It's with us for the long term. And then third is what I would call the rise of modern Islamic extremism. This belief among a fraction of the Muslim population, among fundamentalists, who believe that the modern world and the West is an existential threat to their religion, and a belief that their religion calls on them to fight that with violence. Dates to 1979, as you know, and that has been with us for a long time, and it is going to continue to be with us. So the old Middle East continues on. All three of those things are a threat to Israel and are a threat to U.S. interests in the Middle East and to U.S. interests beyond the Middle East. So the new Middle East, how do I see the new Middle East? I think three things as well. One is the arrival of the other great powers, so Russia and China. I was having a conversation recently with somebody from the Israeli government who said 1967, 1973, 2015. And I said, what happened in 2015? And he said, that's when the Russians showed up in the Middle East. He said, you know, I go to Moscow now more often than I go to the United States. Total domination of Syria, with an interest in expanding its influence to Iraq and even to Saudi Arabia. And people aren't paying attention here in the United States. So the arrival of the Russians in the Middle East, the Chinese in the Middle East. What they bring is economic clout and investment and trade, and They're in discussions with a number of places about potential military bases. So the Chinese are there in significant numbers. So this nation-state struggle, right? The return of major nation conflict is back, and it's back in the Middle East in a major way. Second is, I think, in this struggle with the Iranians over hegemony in the region, we're all losing. The Iranians have made significant strides since the fall of Saddam. At the end of the day, the fall of Saddam was a gift to the Iranians. I think Iraq is essentially lost to the Iranians. So I think that is a part of the new Middle East. And third is the withdrawal of my own country from a leadership role in the region. It was of deep frustration to the region when President Obama was in office. There was great hope when President Trump was elected that he would reverse that. And while he has done so rhetorically, he has not done so practically, I don't believe. And I believe in the absence of U.S. leadership, that void tends to get filled by bad guys. And I think that's happening. So I think all three of those trends as well put Israeli interests at risk and American interests at risk. So the old Middle East and new Middle East.
Yaakov, a question to you about that. Mike made mention of new presences over there. He also made a mention of Iran and delegations to Russia. Where is the state of Israel with regard to Russia and Iran? And also, what are some of the positive aspects of the new Middle East when it comes to Israel's interests and security opportunities?
Well, first of all, thank you for coming. Thank you, Benjamin, Rosita. And thank you, Mike, for accepting, it's not a debate, appearing together on this honorable stage. Let me start and make 2 or 3 short remarks. Nowadays, Israel shares with the biggest moderate Arab countries 2 main interests. The first one is the anti-Iranian. Saudi Arabia is much more afraid or worried from a nuclear Iran than Israel. It's Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, 2 countries which we have a peace with them, kind of cold peace, but a stable one. The Gulf countries, etc. And the second interest, which was mentioned by my colleague Mike, is the fight or the pursue after the radical Islam. These 2 interests can bring or create, if I may phrase it like that, a new Middle East. But practically, it's not happening yet. Because Israel is surrounded by numerous terrorist organizations, starting from the north, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, what the remains of ISIS in Syria, the Iranian heavy presence on the Syrian broken or the Syrian mutiny, if you would like to call it like that. We have in the south, of course, the Hamas with a very, very bad humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. So Israel is involved, not yet physically, but in 3 fronts, the northern one, the Syrian one, and the southern one. We are trying, and you asked me about the Russian. Yeah. No doubt that the Russian involvement in Syria is heavy. I haven't got another description. They are trying to keep Assad's regime. They are favoring some of the Iranian activities, and they are helping not directly, even the Hezbollah, which is a cruel and brutal terror organization. Their presence is purely anti-American in the Middle East. It's not because they are in love with the Syrian guys. They understand their involvement in this hardcore dispute in the Middle East, which lasts for the last 6, 7, or 8 years, is very important for them. I must mention that there is a kind of coordination on air operations between Israel and Syria. Goes back to the good relations as it's published here and there between Netanyahu and Putin. I wouldn't trust Putin. I am not a Bibi follower, but in that case, I am trusting Bibi more than his counterpart. And the fact that the peace process with the Palestinians is frozen and nobody comes with new ideas, everybody waits for the American deal to come after the Israel elections, in which I think many are in my idea that nothing will happen out of it. Mr. Trump says that it's the deal of the century. I hope, but I cannot promise you that it will happen. So I'll finalize and tell you that there is a new idea coming on. We call it the New State Solution, and I'll mention it in 2 sentences. We think that there is a possibility to lease from the Egyptian 10% of the Sinai Desert. Egypt is holding 60,000 square meters in the Sinai Desert. Kilometers, sorry. And it will be possible to lease from Mr. Sisi 10% to widen the Gaza Strip and to build a new Palestinian independent state there. Of course, I'm not going to answer, and there are not really good answers for what's going to happen in the West Bank and the problem of Jerusalem. These are heavy, difficult, and complicated problems. But we are trying to find new ideas because the negotiations between Palestine and Israel have failed. Put the blame on Israel, put the blame on the Palestinians, it doesn't matter. The fact is that nothing moves, and a separation between the state of Israel and the Palestinian is an Israeli interest. It's a must.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, Mike, you made mention about the new actors there, the Russians in particular. You made mention of. How do you anticipate the states of Israel will interact with the Russians? Is the interaction, the increased interaction and the deconfliction a consequence of need, or is it a consequence of pragmatism, given what you mentioned about a sort of absence of a defined policy from the United States over there? And how do you see that bearing out?
I think it's a reflection of the fact that they're there and you have to deal with them, right? And they're not going away.
Can you define what you mean when you say that they're there? What are the assets? What's on the ground? Who are they supporting? If you can just get some detail around that.
So I think Yaakov got it just right. I mean, we're talking about Russian military assets in fairly large numbers, along with advisors on the ground, assisting the Assad government in reestablishing control over the country. It's that simple. And the Russians don't plan on going home when this is done. They plan on staying. They plan on trying to expand their influence in the region. And Yaakov is absolutely right. This has nothing to do with Russian interests. This has everything to do with simply undermining the United States of America anywhere in the world that they can. You know, one of the things, this is outside the Middle East, but one of the things the Russians do is provide support to the Taliban. And you say to yourself, why in the world would the Russians, who fear Islamic extremism as much as we do, provide support to an Islamic extremist group, the Taliban? And the answer is simply to make the life of the United States more difficult in Afghanistan. And they do that everywhere they can. They don't have any assets to bring to the table. They don't have strength to bring to the table. So what their goal is to weaken the United States everywhere and the United States' allies. But since they're in Israel's backyard, literally, Israel has to deal with them. And that's a reality. Now, I don't think the marriage between Russia and Iran is necessarily
A holy marriage.
a holy marriage. It is totally a marriage of convenience. And there is the Russians aren't in with the Iranians for the long term. It is possible to peel the Russians away from the Iranians. Now, that would be an extraordinarily complicated process, but it is certainly worth a try.
I just want to ask you one other question about it, and then I'll come back to you, Yaakov. So the Russian presence there, it doesn't just seem to be a consequence of the fact that the Russians want to be there. It also seems to be a consequence of a lack of interest or lack of a clear policy, and that's what I'm really trying to get to from successive administrations.
So earlier on, I said one of the defining characteristics of the new Middle East was an relative absence of the United States. I believe that the Obama administration, and look, I sat at the sit-room table, so I was there. I didn't make policy, but I put the intelligence on the table. I believe we had an opportunity in the fall of 2012. Assad was deeply hurt, deeply damaged, was to some extent in deep trouble. And I believe a little bit more U.S. involvement at that moment could have brought him down. I think we should have taken some more risk. We didn't. The Iranians came in and saved him at that moment. And then 2 years later, he was in trouble again, and the Russians came in and saved him. So I think that I think there was a vacuum that we left that we shouldn't have left. We should have played a bigger role in Syria.
Well, first of all, I'd like to hear, just on that particular point, where does the State of Israel want to see American policy with regard to Syria? And if you can comment on the recent statements of the president, that would be a withdrawal, and then that withdrawal was slowed down dramatically. How is all that to the favor of the State of Israel as well?
Well, I have to be very careful when I'm calling the United States to be more involved in the Middle East. I wouldn't say that the American public will like it. But yes, we would like that the Americans will show some more courage, not letting the ground totally to the Russians. I think it's the interest of the United States. How can it be done? Either through diplomatic channels or other ways, or on the ground, it's a big question that we can discuss for hours. The fact that the small force of the American is leaving in these days Syria, or a specific point in Syria, is not something that Israel is happy for, and I'll be very modest. So it's a question of the big powers which are playing on our playground. And trying to look into the details, yes, Russia replaced what the United States have failed to go into the vacuum. When you are looking on the situation in Syria, in greater Syria or Iraq, you can see Hezbollah, you can see Iran, you can see ISIS, you can see the irregular Syrian army, you can see those who deserted from the army and are fighting against the regime, and Russia. Of course, several smaller groups of terrorists here and there. And Russia plays quite sophisticatedly with all the power involved. The fact that Israel is bombing almost every week, sometimes every night, ammunitions, expedition from the airport of Damascus to Hezbollah is not a secret to the Russians. I wouldn't tell you they are approving it, but they know when to shut our eyes and to give us the possibility to do it. So they are playing a very, very sophisticated game, and we are lacking the involvement of our greatest ally, the United States.
Mike, you wanted to come back on that.
Yeah, I just want to say it is extraordinarily important to understand that the withdrawal of the United States from its traditional leadership role in the world is a reflection of our domestic politics. It is not grand strategy on the part of the United States. It's a reflection of the fact that the American people for quite some time have been saying, we have our own problems here at home. Let's let somebody else, let's fix those. Let's let somebody else worry about the problem overseas. How come we're always the ones, right, to fix those problems? And both parties have reacted to that by pulling back. This began in the Obama administration and it continues in this administration. And we won't be able to fix the foreign policy problem until we fix our own problems here at home. It's simply not possible. One flows from the other. When I go out and talk to groups about this, the point I make is, look, it is expensive. It is expensive to play the leadership role in the world. But the lesson of World War II is that you pay now or you pay a lot more later. And we either pay now and return to our traditional leadership role in the world, or we are going to again pay a lot more later, I guarantee you.
So you're a strong advocate for the need for grand strategy.
Absolutely.
So I want to know, I'm going to just ask two more questions before I open it to the audience. I want to deal with Iran. And Mike, I'm actually going to ask you, first of all, if I could, and I'd like you to bring in the outcome of the adjustments made by the Trump administration to the deal. But you made a very strong statement. You spoke about losing an area and believing that Iraq is lost to the Iranians. I'd like you to speak about that. And again, I'd like you to draw it to Israel, how you see Israel responding to that with the United States. Just paint a picture of what Iran is and what Iran isn't with regards to the state of Israel.
Look, I think, Iran is an extraordinarily significant threat to the United States and to our allies in the region and to our allies more broadly. If this were an indictment, the indictment would be long. Count one would be this desire for hegemony in the region, this desire to be the strongest player in the region, to call the shots, to define the agenda. This is a desire. This is very much like Putin's desire for reestablishment of the Russian Empire. This is a desire for a reestablishment of the Persian Empire. And as I said earlier, this goes way back in Iranian history. Indictment number two is, I think it's fair to say that Iran is the only country in the world that still practices terrorism as a tool of statecraft. So the IRGC Quds Force conducts terrorism. Indictment count number three is the support for other terrorist groups. Hezbollah would not exist without the support it receives from Iran. And Sunni groups whose sole purpose is to undermine the state of Israel. Count four is support for insurgent groups in the region, whether that be the Houthis in Yemen, whether that be Shia groups in eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia or in Bahrain. So support to insurgent groups. What count are we on? Count 5? Count 5 is a policy objective that the state of Israel should go away, that the state of Israel should be wiped off the face of the planet. And this is not my assessment. You can go read what the supreme leader has written. You know, he tweets quite a bit, not quite as much as my president, but he tweets quite a bit. And you can see what he has to say about Israel. And why is it so important for the Iranians, for the state of Israel to go away? It's for the same reason that they want the United States out of the region, because you can't be the hegemonic power in the region as long as the United States is there and Israel is there. Count number 6 is the nuclear program, right? The Obama administration, this was a deal I supported, by the way. This is a deal I supported because it set back the program and capped the program for a significant period of time. Didn't solve the problem, but it capped it and set it back for a significant period of time. But the ambition is probably still there. And so that's count number 6. So we got big problems with this country. And I don't think we have a strategy, certainly not a grand strategy. We don't have a strategy. The United States doesn't have a strategy that then brings in all the countries in the region for how we're going to deal with this.
I'll add,
Yaakov,
with your permission, I'll add in 2 remarks. First of all, I fully accept that the Iranian role is trying to be the hegemony in the region. And there is a fight between Egypt used to be, in the past. Saudi Arabia wants to be, not yet. Turkey and Iran. Second, yes, it's a terror state. Terror is manipulated by the regime. It's a policy. And all the proxies are Hezbollah, Hamas, and other groups that are financed, equipped by the Iranian. My friend, Mr. Morell, I was against the deal. But we have to stick to reality, and we accepted it. I think that the main mistakes were the fact that the sanctions were down too strongly, too immediate. Mr. Trump tried to fix it now, and as far as I'm looking on the situation, not with a very good, big success, because the nuclear Iranian deal or plan is on the way. They are advancing. They are cheating the world because they are smart, one of the most smartest people on earth. And we will find in 2, 3, more or less years, a nuclear Iran. Their claim is that it's for peace purposes. If somebody in the audience believes them, let him raise up.
So you made mention there. I heard you say that yesterday about your belief that there is a nuclear Iran in what length of time did you say?
2, 3,
2, 3 years. So, Mike, do you see it that way? And if you do see it that way, how does the world respond to something? Are we just going to see this balancing act, such as we're seeing in North Korea?
So it's my understanding that what the international community sees, and what the inspectors, the IAEA inspectors see, is that the Iranians are in compliance with the deal. I'm not naive enough to believe that the Iranians might not be doing something outside of the deal in some secret location. There's a history to that. GOM was designed to be a secret facility to produce fissile material for a weapon. When the Iranians were caught, they turned it into a civilian, turned it into part of their civilian program, but it was only because they were caught. So I'm not naive enough to believe that somewhere in that country they're not cheating, but as far as I know, nobody has discovered that yet.
Right.
Nobody's discovered that, as far as I know. So as far as I know, the Iranians are not only living up to the part of the deal that we can see, but nobody's discovered a secret location. If we do, then I think, you know, it's back to the drawing board. And I think all options are on the table for how we should respond.
So I didn't get to the issue of space. I invite people from the audience too. It's very important that we do take questions from the audience. So by show of hands, if we can just have one question, and then we'll go with the answers of the panelists and on to the next one. There are only three questions. Okay, you, sir.
With regards to Syria, I have a question. What was the optimum result in the conflict in Syria for Israel? Because as you know, they had Assad, that is strongly supported by Iran, but also the FSA is strongly supported by Sunni terrorist organizations. And the Kurds in the northeast don't really have very strong ambitions to take over the whole area. So what would have been the optimum situation for Israel?
There are elements in Israel that are claiming that, that the fact that Assad is staying as the Syrian ruler is one of the good sides of the occurrences in Syria. And it's logical. First of all, Israel gained, if I may use this term, the fact that we have the Golan Heights and nobody claims now. So just this morning, Senator Lindsey from the US Senate visited with Mr. Netanyahu the Golan Heights, and he said that he is going to try and to ask the United States to recognize the Golan Heights as a part of Israel, but that's only a side. Syria became, instead of greater Syria, a small Syria, very small. And the question is, what will happen with the territories? Till the decline of the ISIS, 8 million people were under Daesh or ISIS control. Not anymore. Optimum for Israel will be that either the Iraqi, which is also an illusion, or the Syrian will get more territory. If you ask me, it will not happen. So it will be no man's land for many, many years, and a big, big problem, trouble, and sensitive issue for Israel.
So you're agreeing with that?
Absolutely, 100%.
Okay. Next question. Yes, madam, over there.
So what potential does the U.S. have to partner with the local regional countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, even Jordan, and possibly even China as an external factor in order to maybe create like an alliance against Iran and potentially nuclear Iran? And then secondly, is it...
One question, one answer. I knew you were going to try it. And I'm going to take that to Mike first, if you would, Mike, if you could answer that question.
I think it'll be extraordinarily difficult to bring the Chinese into any sort of strategy to contain the Iranians.
Except economical. If it will be economical, maybe.
But so they were part, right? So they were part of these sanctions.
Yeah.
Right? They were part of the, and as were the Russians.
Right.
I mean, that was the beauty of the Bush administration, Obama administration sanctions against Iran, is they were global. Yeah. Everybody supported them. There was UN Security Council approval across the board, right? They were powerful. But China wants to buy its way out of problems more than use force or that sort of thing. So I worry about China in the long term, right? They'd rather have the Iranian oil than anything else. Iranian move towards a weapon again that people saw would have the potential to be able to bring the Chinese in. I think the problem with the rest of the region is outside of just a couple of countries, there's not a lot of capability. So it really does come down at the end of the day to a handful of countries, the United States, Israel, a couple of others, who actually have the capabilities to be able to push back on the Iranians. Most of the countries in the region simply don't have the intelligence and military capabilities in order to do that.
Dr. Nassif. Next question. We'll take one from Alan. Yeah.
So I believe Director Morell touched on this a little bit, but every time we see Assad essentially use chemical weapons on his people, there's a consensus from the American public that we need to do something, And then when it comes to an election season, the American public sits back and says, it's not our problem, we can't be in the region. How do we reconcile these two differing views, and how do we get people on the same page, the American public on the same page, that we actually need to be involved for this not to happen?
So I say two things. One is, I really like sitting up here, as opposed to sitting down there. This is kind of fun. Second thing I'll say is you're asking me a question to analyze my own country as opposed to analyze other countries, which I did for the bulk of my career.
And I am lucky that you are here.
And since I retired in 2013, I've traveled all over the place. And I've talked to a lot of different kind of people. And my sense is, and it's a pretty strong sense, that the American public is very quick to be concerned about, want its government to take action with regard to direct threats to the United States of America, what they see as direct threats to the United States of America. For example, ISIS. For example, North Korea and its ability to detonate a nuclear warhead, possibly detonate a nuclear warhead over the continental United States. So they understand those threats, they want their government to do something about them, and they're supportive of that action. The more subtle threats and challenges they don't see. Or they even see them and they ask, what does that have to do with me? So I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, what does it have to do with me in the middle of the country, maybe an unemployed blue-collar worker, what does it have to do with me that Vladimir Putin is messing around in Ukraine? Or what does it have to do with me that the Chinese are trying to dominate the South China Sea? What does it have to do with me that the Iranians are trying to gain influence in Yemen or build a Hezbollah-type organization in Yemen? What does that have to do with me? And the truth of the matter is that our leadership, the leadership of the country has I think, failed the country for some time in answering those questions. There's answers to those questions, and they're good answers, but we haven't done that. And until we start doing that, until we start explaining to them why these things really matter, we're not going to get sustained support for the kind of foreign policy we need.
Other questions, please? Yes, madam.
Thank you. So my question is about this great power competition, and I'd like to play a little bit of devil's advocate at the moment and ask you, what really are the stakes for the U.S. if we continue to not play a leadership role in the region and let China and Russia step in? Concrete, what are the stakes?
Yaakov and I had a conversation about this earlier. You know, why does the Middle East matter to the United States? I hear that question a lot, too.
Incidentally, increasingly so.
Yes. And there's two answers to that question. The first is that Israel sits right in the middle of this mess. And there is long-standing, widespread, bipartisan, significant support for the concept of a state of Israel in the United States. And there's widespread support for improved relations between the United States and Israel. The polling on that has been consistent for a very, very long period of time. So the American people believe their government has a responsibility to help protect Israel. That's reason number one. Reason number two is that the Middle East exports its problems. They don't stay there. They export their problems in the way of terrorism, in the way of refugees and in the way of unstable oil prices. From an economic perspective, oil prices can be high, they can be low, it doesn't really matter. From an economic perspective, what the problem is oil prices that go up and down and up and down and up and down. That's a problem economically. It's a problem for businessmen making investments. So those are the two reasons we care deeply about the Middle East. And I fear that the extent to which we step out and the Russians and Chinese step in, that those problems, security of Israel, and somebody willing to do something, to actually take action and do something about the problems that lead to the export of threats and challenges get worse. And I'll make it even more concrete by taking it outside the region. I was on the National Defense Strategy Commission, which just 3 or 4 months ago completed its report. And if you haven't read it, you must absolutely read it, because it paints a pretty pessimistic picture of our defense capabilities vis-a-vis our rivals. And it actually says, there's actually a sentence in there that says, if the U.S. had to fight a war today against China or Russia in their backyard, we would struggle to win and could possibly lose that war. Let me paint a very specific picture for you. If Taiwan declared independence tomorrow, I guarantee you that the Chinese would invade Taiwan. 100% chance the Chinese would invade Taiwan. And the question for the United States of America would not be, could we defend Taiwan? The question would be, could we take it back? Would the President of the United States at the time, whoever that is, decide to go to war with China in order to take Taiwan back from the Chinese? If the President decided not to, we would be seen by the world as having given up on a commitment we made to Taiwan, and our credibility would be damaged beyond repair. So that's why this great power competition matters so much. I'll stop there before I go on too long.
I'll add the 2 sentences. First of all, I fully accept Mike's remarks, but you have to add to Israel also the moderate Arabic countries. Jordan is in a very, very weak and fragile position, King Abdullah. Saudi Arabia has internal issues which the United States is looking and trying to play there, but not in a very determined way. Gulf countries, the majority, except Qatar, are also a kind of more Western trend. And if you are adding the Mediterranean, the passage from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, the oil issues, natural gas in our area, it's a strategic point for the United States, and the United States should be involved. In Israel, the United States is involved. They are helping us. They are supporting us. We have our sometimes difference of opinions, but still big allies. With other countries in the Middle East, the Russian and the Iranian involvement are much higher, and it will be quite an expensive prize in the future.
Other questions, if we have? You, sir, in the middle. Yes, please.
There's been some analysis in the media that Assad, once he feels more secure, ISIS perhaps more fully defeated, will attempt to ease Iranian influence out of his country, reintegrate himself much more with the Sunni Arab powers. Do you think this is a realistic policy to look for Assad, pushing, easing the Iranians out once he feels any more secure?
So I think the Assad government is a secular government. Absolutely. Would he, once he regains control of his country, would he like to rid himself of Russian and Iranian influence? Yes. Will he be able to? That is going to be extraordinarily difficult. And if it happens, it'll be over the very long term. So I think we are, for the moment and for the foreseeable future, stuck with significant Russian and Iranian influence in Syria. It's a given.
Assad has still what he remembers from his father, the Russian involvement. And at that time, it didn't help him. It was vice versa. So he would like to get rid, when he is stronger, etc., from the Russians. I'm not sure about the Iranian, mainly because the Hezbollah or the close border with Lebanon involvement, so he will not be able, even if he wants. And Syria is not really supported by the majority of the Arab League or the majority of the Arab countries. So he has to be dependent on the big powers, Iran and Russia, as it is now. So it will take, if at all, it will take a hell of a time.
Anyone, any other questions, please? I just want to start with the gentleman there. Yes, and then I'll come to you, Mr. Langer. Yes, you, sir. Yes.
So Mike made a very good point. What happens if China invades Taiwan tomorrow? Would the United States come to its aid? And this is really a question for Yaakov. There seems to be some type of tenuous agreement when Israel bombs Iranian assets in Syria, that somehow we're allowed to do that. Yet Russia has now installed better SAM missiles.
Yeah.
At what point does that become a danger zone to Israel, where they're protecting their land, they're protecting their people, and trying to destroy these assets that the Iranians continue to bring in? We have no idea what has really slipped through. When does Russia push a button and say, no, enough is enough?
Let me compliment you. It's a very, very good question. Because lately, we can see a transfer of these batteries of missiles to the regular Syrian army. And as soon that they will complete the transfer, and the less and less Russian engineers and experts will be on ground, it will be a major threat for Israel plains or Israel Golan Heights or land. For the time being, it's balanced because the Russians are giving us kind of a permission to bomb because we are not bombing regular Syrian army and we are not bombing regular Lebanese army. We are scratching Iranians and attacking mainly the Hezbollah. So it's a formula that Russia can take. But as soon as they will take over the Russian equipment, it will be another story and another difficulty to handle, no doubt.
I'm going to take, Mike, do you want to come back?
No, that's good.
I'm going to take one last question, and I'll finish with a quick comment, if I may. Yes?
I wanted to ask, so you mentioned in 2003 or maybe 2002, the US made a decision to take out Iraq, not Iran. So I wanted to ask, what went into that calculation? Why did they choose Iraq over Iran?
I wasn't at the policy table. I was lower down in the organization at the time. But I believe that President Bush was deeply concerned about two things. One was he believed, based on what we, the intelligence community, was telling him, that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, that he had chemical weapons, that he had a biological weapons production capability, and he was reconstituting his nuclear weapons program. Those were all wrong, but we believed it. We were telling him Saddam's got these weapons, and we were telling him that Saddam has relationships with terrorist organizations, not with Al-Qaeda, but with other terrorist organizations, and had a long history of that. primarily anti-Israel terrorist organizations. And the president, given what had just happened to the United States, the largest single attack on our country in its history, what had just happened to the United States, I think the president was deeply concerned that somehow that Iraq WMD was going to get into the hands of terrorists who would not hesitate to use it. So that is what drove the president's decision with regard to removing Saddam Hussein.
First of all, I just want to thank our panelists, or experts rather. It's tremendous to learn from someone such as you, Mike. Thank you so very much for being here and for giving of your time and your expertise and your focus for the duration of our gathering. It means a great deal to us. And of course, Yaakov, the very same. Thank you so very much. Everybody here deeply appreciates the service of both of you. We're adjourned.